What's good, mini crafters? My name's Samuel. In today's video, we're going to be diving into wet blending. What is it? How do you do it? And when do you do it? And later in the video, I'm going to share a few top secret tips and tricks that I've learned to use and I think will really help you be better at wet blending on your own minis. Let's first define what wet blending is. Wet blending is the technique of blending two colors together while still wet on a miniature to create a transition between the two colors. It can be a pretty fast way to cover a large area on a miniature and create a pretty smooth transition and blend between two colors. Now there are a few nuances that you should be aware of in order to pull this technique off successfully and things that you need to be aware of when doing this. But before we jump into what those are, let's show you what wet blending looks like. There are a few ways that you can wet blend, and I'm going to show you those. But first I'm going to be starting with demonstrating on these little square styrene pieces that I've primed up. This is going to help us get the basics down and remove any variables that you might have from mini to mini. I'm using two Citadel paint colors, Emperor's Children Pink and Mephiston Red. Now, I didn't pick these colors for any particular reason other than because I thought they would blend well together and they would look good. The first way that you can wet blend is to apply two discrete colors onto the surface of your mini or whatever you're painting. You want to make sure that you're going to clean your brush in between each color, and then with a damp, clean brush, you're going to want to pull your brush in a downward motion, working up and down between the transition of the two colors, mixing them together. You should add more of each color to each side and continue working them together, blending both colors into the still wet paint until you're happy with the look. Something that can help is to let the first coat of your transition dry and then go back and apply a second coat to reinforce and intensify the colors. This also doubles as a way to smooth the blend even further. The second way to wet blend is to first apply one of your colors to the entire area of whatever you're painting. From there, you want to clean your brush and load it with your second color. Apply that, starting where you want that to be the most intense, and blend that down into your first color. Similar to the first method, doing a second coat can help to boost your color intensity and help solidify your blended transition. However, with this method, the second color you apply won't be as intense, but the overall transition between the two colors is likely to be smoother. Now the third method of wet blending is where we start to get crazy. With this method, do either method 1 or 2, but start on a pre-wetted surface and then wet blend on top of that. You could even mix your water with a 1-to-1 ratio of retarder to slow down the drying time of your paints. This allows you to work longer with the paint before it dries out, and it lets you get that creamy blend that you're after. Employing this third method can also give you a more diluted look if that's the effect that you're trying to get. I should say that these are not the only 3 ways that you can wet blend. They're just the 3 primary ways that I have done them in the past and the ones that I am the most familiar with. If you have another method that you use that I didn't talk about here, drop it in the comments below so we can all learn together. With these 3 methods hammered out, let's get a little crunchy and dive into the finer points of this technique. I also conducted a few wet blending experiments of my own, and I think the results will surprise you. Tip number 1, the paint that I'm using when I wet blend is not thinned as much as you might think. When you thin your paint with water, you increase how fast it dries, which can actually make wet blending really difficult to do. To help combat your paint from drying out too quickly, you want to add some retarder to your mix. Or you could just do what I do and mix a little bit of glaze medium into the paint. This is going to help to not only thin your color, but it's going to slow down the drying process and it's going to get you that nice creamy texture that you want. Crunchy detail number 2, paint brushes. The brush that I'm using for this technique does not have a super fine tip like we normally want, but that's by choice. When wet blending, you want to use a brush that has a wider tip, sort of like a filbert style brush, or you could just use an older brush that's kind of lost its tip. Really the goal here is that you don't want a super fine tip on your brush. That'll actually make this technique harder to achieve. Using a wider bodied brush is actually going to help you apply a more seamless transition as opposed to a sharp pointed one. Next, let's address the brush stroke direction. Something that you want to keep in mind, not just with this technique, but when painting in general, is that when you end your brush stroke, the majority of your paint's going to be deposited at the tip of your brush. And this can be particularly important when you're trying to blend a darker color into a lighter color, like you often are when you wet blend. With a paintbrush, when you do the up and down motion that comes with wet blending, a little bead of paint appears at the tip of your brush. And if you're pushing your shadows into your highlights, you're going to be fighting this little bead the whole way into your highlight or whenever you decide to stop your blending. So how do we avoid this? Well, by changing the direction of your brush stroke. As far as I can tell, the best way to overcome this is to pull each color into each other rather than push them into each other. An easy way to remember this is to point the brush tip towards the color that is loaded into the brush. This is going to help ensure that that little bead of paint, which is constantly changing color as you blend, is going to be deposited closest to the part of the gradient that it matches. Time to get extra super crunchy for this tip. Something to be aware of when wet blending is mass tone and undertone. Now, these aren't just fancy pants art terms that I'm throwing around to seem smartsy. Get it? Smart, artsy, smartsy. Thickly applied paint that is opaque is your mass tone, and when it's spread out and translucent, that's your undertone. So when you're wet blending, if you apply your two colors in a thick fashion and then try to blend them with that up and down paint stroke motion that I showed you earlier, you're likely going to be scraping away some of your mass tone, which will in turn reveal your undertone. This can leave you with some really unappealing stripes in your blend if you don't correct it. Now, the way I avoid this is by applying my paint as an undertone or thinly and not as a mass tone. When I do it this way, when I do my downward strokes, there are no nasty stripes because there's no mass tone that I'm scraping away. Of course, take this with a grain of salt because what I'm talking about here applies more towards larger, flatter surfaces. If you're working on a miniature and you're doing something small, say scales for example, then you would be okay to apply your paint thicker as you would be far less likely to scrape away any paint on a smaller area. This is more of an issue on larger surfaces. Now it's time for some neat experiments that I conducted. When wet blending, I assume that the hardest colors to blend together would be the ones that have the most contrast, both in color and in hue. So can you wet blend black and white together? The answer is yes, but you're gonna have to futz around with it more and give it some extra loving to get all those gray tones to appear in that blend. Now what about with complementary colors like yellow and purple or green and red? Same answer here. You can blend these, but it might take you a bit longer to achieve that, and it's gonna be harder than blending something like a lighter blue and a darker blue, for example. So what about metallics? How does that work? Do those wet blend well? For my testing, everything worked the same as it does with the other colors. And to be honest, I wasn't sure how this was gonna go with metallics, and I'm pretty excited because I didn't think it was gonna look very good. But this is really opening up some of the possibilities for potential true metallic metal colors that I can do in the future, and being able to shade those in unique ways. Okay, now that I've painted all the plastic squares that I own, probably should try this out on an actual miniature. He's gone too far this time. Painting actual miniatures, please, what's next? Finishing his box of Deathwing Knights? Here is a surface that's very similar to the little styrene squares that I demonstrated on. It's a larger flat surface. Now I'm employing method 1 here, where you place both colors and then with a clean brush start to create that transition between the two colors. After I'm satisfied, I then reapply my highlight, and I can even add a brighter highlight and then blend between those two colors. This is more nuanced and allows me to practice wet blending in a tighter area, which is going to boost the look that I'm going for. Another easy example of doing wet blending on a mini is in the base coating step. For example, on this Dwarf Warrior, I'm wet blending across the entire mini to provide an interesting undercoat using red and purple. This is going to give my shadows some interesting complexity when I start applying layers on top. What about wet blending on a non-flat surface? Instead, what if it's something like the tentacles on my little displacer beast here? You're going to find that the basic rules still apply, but it might require you to go back and forth a little bit more to get that seamless blend all along the cylindrical shape. Sometimes you can wet blend between more than two colors. In this case, the base of my tentacles are a desaturated blue color, and then I'm going to blend that into a dim purple. And from there, I'm going to go to a middle purple that I can wet blend into a pinkish purple. This multi-wet blended process can give you a really nice transition across all these colors. With narrower cylindrical shapes, this process can take a few passes to get it looking the way you want, but don't be afraid to let your first blend dry and go back over to reinforce that transition. I feel like wet blending is kind of like a buzzword. You hear that in the hobby space, and if you know how to wet blend, you know how to blend. And that's not true. There are other techniques that I plan to go over in future videos, like feathering or glazing. Those are other techniques that you can use. And I think it's really neat, and it shows your grasp of miniature painting when you can apply multiple techniques together to get the look that you're after. Something that I've seen other painters do, and similar to how I did on the Dwarf, when you do wet blending across the base coat, that can help you quickly establish shadows and highlights before going in and adding neat details and layers on top. But how are you going to use wet blending? Drop a comment below letting me know. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, consider liking, subscribing, or sharing with a hobby nerd friend who maybe is trying to get into the world of wet blending. Also, be sure to click the little bell down below. That's going to notify you when I drop a new video. I do them every other Friday, so be sure that you're in the know for those. If you like the video and you want to support the channel, I do have Amazon affiliate links in the description below. Those go to tools, products, things that I use that you can get, and it gives a little extra kickback to the channel at no extra cost to you. Can't wait to see you in the next one, but until then, keep on crafting.